The hum of my engine was the only sound in the vast, empty expanse of the Wyoming highway. Miles of desolation stretched out ahead of me, the moonlight catching the occasional glint of a rabbit's eyes darting across the road. I adjusted my CB radio, half hoping for chatter, but the channel was dead silent. Trucking at night, alone, had its perks. Less traffic, cooler air, but it also had its moments when the silence felt almost sentient. I was hauling a load of steel beams to a construction site in Salt Lake City. Routine, nothing special. But there was something off about that night, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the eerie stillness of the plains or the strange fog that clung stubbornly to the edges of the road, refusing to dissipate under my headlights. It felt like I was driving through a dream, one of those uneasy dreams where nothing seems right but you can't wake up. About 50 miles from the nearest town, my CB crackled to life. Breaker 19, anyone got their ears on? The voice was faint, scratchy, but unmistakably human. I grabbed the mic, relieved to hear another soul. "This is Blacktop Pete," I said, using my handle. "What's up, friend?" A pause. "Then you're not alone out there. You see him yet?" My grip on the mic tightened. "See who?" The voice didn't respond. Instead, the channel dissolved into static, a long, grating hiss that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at my side mirrors, scanning the darkness behind me. Nothing but the faint outline of my trailer and the empty highway. I was about to chalk it up to a prank, some bored trucker looking to spook a newbie, when a shadow moved on the edge of my vision. Something was out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights. It wasn't an animal. I knew the way deer and coyotes moved. This was different. It was deliberate. I slowed the truck to a crawl, leaning forward in my seat to get a better look. That's when I saw him. A figure standing on the side of the road, motionless, watching me. He was tall, his body wrapped in what looked like a long, tattered coat. His face was obscured by the brim of a wide hat, casting a shadow that swallowed his features. But what unsettled me most were his hands, long and pale, with fingers that seemed unnaturally elongated, hanging almost to his knees. I passed him slowly, heart hammering, my eyes fixed on the mirrors. He didn't move, didn't turn to follow my truck with his gaze. He just stood there, like a statue carved from the very shadows of the night. When I finally pulled my eyes away, the CB crackled again. The same voice, clearer this time, as though the speaker was sitting in the cab beside me. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." I took the warning to heart, my foot pressing the gas pedal a little harder than necessary. The truck groaned as it picked up speed, and my eyes darted between the road ahead and the mirrors. That figure, there was something profoundly wrong about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen it move, just barely, as I passed. The CB crackled again, this time softer, more distorted. "Too late. Already marked? Who is this?" I shouted into the mic, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep calm. "What the hell is going on?" The response was static. Then, just for a moment, I swore I heard a faint chuckle buried in the noise. My headlights caught something in the distance. A rest area, a rare oasis in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't much, just a couple of picnic tables, a bathroom, and a soda machine under a flickering fluorescent light. The kind of place that felt abandoned even when it wasn't. I debated pulling over. My stomach churned with unease, but I needed a break. My hands were shaking, and the dull throb of adrenaline was making it hard to focus. Against my better judgment, I signaled and eased the truck off the highway. The lot was empty, as expected. I parked at the far end, keeping the headlights on, their beams cutting through the thickening fog. Leaving the engine running, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and unnatural for a summer night. It carried an odd, metallic scent, like blood mixed with ozone. I walked towards the soda machine, pretending to check it out, but really, I was scanning the area. The restroom doors were slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Shadows pooled around the picnic tables, and the fluorescent light above me buzzed loudly, its flicker creating disorienting flashes. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like nails on concrete. It was coming from the restroom. My pulse quickened, and every instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck and floor it. But something about the sound pulled me closer, like I had no choice in the matter. The flashlight beam wavered as my grip faltered. I reached the restroom doorway, the scraping louder now, rhythmic. It echoed in the cold, empty air, setting my teeth on edge. I peered inside, and for a moment, all I could see was the dull sheen of the tiled floor and the cracked sink hanging precariously from the wall. Then I saw them. Footprints. Bare, wet footprints leading from the sink to one of the stalls. The door to the stall was slightly open, swinging gently on its hinges. My breath caught in my throat. The scraping noise had stopped. "Hello," I called, my voice breaking. No response. I edged closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The door creaked as I nudged it open with the beam of light. It was empty. Relief washed over me like a wave, though it was short-lived. As I turned to leave, my flashlight caught something on the mirror above the sink. Words scrawled in what looked like dirt or grease. I had to get closer to read them, but I instantly regretted it. "He follows those who see him." The letters dripped slowly, as if they were still being written. That's when the door slammed shut behind me. The sound of the door slamming echoed like a gunshot in the confined restroom. I whipped around, flashlight darting across the grimy walls. Nothing. Nobody. The door sat motionless, shut tight. My breaths came fast, fogging the cold air in front of me. A sudden, sharp knock reverberated through the door. 3 precise raps that sent a jolt straight through me. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam scattering wildly across the room. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. The knock came again, harder this time, the door rattling in its frame. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped further back, the tile slick beneath my boots. Then came the voice, low and distorted, like it was being dragged through a layer of static. "You saw him, didn't you?" I froze, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. It spun on its side, casting wild, erratic beams across the room. The voice came again, closer now, almost a whisper. "He's watching you." I lunged for the flashlight, snatching it up as my survival instincts finally kicked in. The door loomed in front of me, its weathered wood and peeling paint suddenly an impossible barrier. My hands fumbled with the handle, slick with sweat. When it finally gave, I threw the door open and burst into the night air, gasping like I'd been underwater. My boots pounded against the concrete as I sprinted back to my truck, the beam of the flashlight bouncing ahead of me. The fog had thickened in the short time I'd been inside, swallowing the edges of the rest area in an impenetrable wall of white. The fluorescent light flickered above me, its hum growing louder, more erratic. Then I saw him. Standing at the edge of the fog, just past the picnic tables, was the figure. The same wide-brimmed hat, the same long coat. He was closer now, his hands hanging motionless at his sides. The fog swirled around him, parting like a curtain, as if it obeyed his presence. "Stay away," I yelled, fumbling for the door handle of my truck. My voice barely carried in the heavy air, but the figure didn't move. He just stood there, his face still obscured by the shadow of the hat. Finally, I wrenched the door open and climbed into the cab, slamming it shut behind me. My fingers fumbled to lock the doors, and I jammed the truck into gear, tires screeching as I pulled out of the lot. The headlights cut through the fog, but the figure was gone. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I was safe, but then the CB crackled to life again. "You can't outrun him," the distorted voice drawled, a cold amusement dripping from its tone. "He's already in the cab." A chill raced down my spine as I glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty, but when I looked into the side mirror, my heart stopped. The figure was sitting on the back of my trailer, perched like some grotesque bird of prey. His long fingers clutched the edge, and his head was tilted slightly, as if he were watching me. Even at 70 miles per hour, he held on effortlessly, his coat billowing in the wind. I floored the accelerator, the engine roaring as the truck surged forward. The figure didn't flinch, didn't move. My knuckles turned white on the wheel, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. Then, as abruptly as he had appeared, he was gone. I kept driving, the fog finally thinning as I neared the outskirts of a small town. The CB was silent now, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the pounding of my heart. I pulled into a well-lit truck stop, parked under the brightest floodlight I could find, and sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath. But as I reached for my logbook, my blood ran cold. Scrawled across the cover, in the same dripping script I'd seen in the restroom, were 3 words: "He's not done." I stared at the words on my logbook, the ink, or whatever it was, still glistening as if freshly written. My mind raced. How could this be happening? I was alone in the truck. I had locked the doors, checked the mirrors, even scanned the cab before I stopped. There was no one here. No one could have written this. Unless he wasn't human. The thought hit me like a freight train, and I instinctively reached for the ignition. The keys were already there, but as I turned them, the truck refused to start. The engine groaned and clicked, the way it does when the battery's dead. But that didn't make sense. The truck had been running fine just moments ago. A new sound broke through the quiet scratching, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from above me, on the roof of the cab. My chest tightened as the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like nails dragging slowly across metal. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were drawn to the windshield as something slid into view. It was his hand. Pale, elongated fingers wrapped around the edge of the cab, their movements impossibly slow and deliberate. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural creak as the rest of him came into view. He leaned over the windshield, his wide-brimmed hat tilted forward, hiding his face in shadows. I couldn't move. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my body felt frozen in place. He was so close I could see the fog of his breath on the glass, the way his coat fluttered in the faint breeze. Then he lifted his head. The face staring back at me wasn't human. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tightly over his skull. His eyes were black voids, empty and endless, drawing me in like a riptide. And his mouth, God, his mouth, stretched into a grotesque grin, far too wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. He tapped the glass once with a long finger, the sound sharp and deliberate. Then he spoke. "You can run," he said, his voice an unnatural mixture of deep bass and static. "But it won't matter." My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight, my only weapon, and slammed it against the glass where his face loomed. The sound reverberated through the cab, but the glass didn't so much as crack. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if amused by my desperation. "You're already mine," he said, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "It's just a matter of time." Without thinking, I grabbed the trucker's crucifix that hung from my rearview mirror and held it up. I didn't know what else to do. It was a desperate, stupid move, but for the first time that night, something changed. He recoiled, his grin faltering as the black voids of his eyes narrowed. The cab filled with a sound like 1,000 screams trapped inside a storm, and his body dissolved into a swirling mass of shadows. The fog outside seemed to gather him up, pulling him away into the night. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The truck started on the first try. I didn't waste a second. I threw it into gear and sped out of the truck stop, keeping my eyes on the road and refusing to look back. The fog cleared as I drove, and by the time I reached Salt Lake City, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I made my delivery, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't really gone. The words on the logbook haunted me, burned into my mind like a brand. He's not done. Even now, weeks later, I sleep with the crucifix under my pillow. I've told myself it's over, that it was some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much coffee. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I swear I hear faint scratching on the windows. And I know he's still out there. Weeks turned into months, but the fear never left me. Every long haul felt like walking a tightrope over a bottomless pit, the memory of that night threatening to pull me under. I took shorter routes, kept my radio off, and avoided night driving whenever I could. But trucking is trucking, and the road doesn't always let you dictate the terms. It was a crisp November evening when I found myself hauling a load of farm equipment through the Colorado Rockies. The sky was clear, the stars bright, and the air cold enough to bite. I tried to convince myself it was just another run. The thing was in the past. It was over. But as the hours passed and the mountains swallowed the road, the unease began creeping back in. The darkness felt heavier here, pressing against the cab like a living thing. I flipped on my high beams, trying to push it back, but it only made the shadows seem deeper. The first sign that something was wrong came around midnight. My GPS, reliable to a fault, started to glitch. The map froze, then spun wildly, and the screen flickered before going completely black. I tapped it, hoping to jolt it back to life, but it was dead. "Great," I muttered, the sound of my own voice oddly comforting in the silence. Then the radio crackled. I froze. I hadn't touched the CB since that night, and I was sure I'd left it off. But there it was, the faint hiss of static filling the cab. My hands tightened on the wheel as I stared at the radio, half expecting the distorted voice to return. Instead, the static grew louder, sharper, until it sounded like the grinding of metal on metal. I reached for the knob, my fingers trembling, but as soon as I touched it, the static stopped. Silence. Then, a single word, clear and unmistakable, cut through the stillness. "Pete." My breath hitched. My handle. No one had called me that since. The headlights flickered. For a split second, the road disappeared, swallowed by darkness. When the lights came back on, the figure was there, standing in the middle of the road. His hat was gone, revealing the full grotesqueness of his face, and his grin had widened to an impossible degree. I slammed on the brakes. The truck shuddered, the trailer skidding as the tires screamed against the asphalt. But the figure didn't move. He stood there, his arms outstretched, as if daring me to hit him. And then he was gone. The truck screeched to a stop, the cab shaking as the trailer settled behind me. I sat there, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my eyes darting from side to side. The road ahead was empty, as if he'd never been there. But I knew better. The radio crackled again, the voice low and mocking. "You can't run, Pete. Not from him. Not from me." I didn't wait to hear more. I threw the truck into gear and sped down the mountain, the engine roaring as I pushed it harder than I ever had. The curves of the road blurred past, my focus locked on the faint glow of lights in the distance. Civilization, safety. But the lights didn't get closer. The road stretched endlessly, twisting and turning but never leading anywhere. The figure appeared again, standing at the side of the road, his empty eyes following me as I passed. Then he was in the rearview mirror, then beside the cab, his grotesque grin reflected in the window. I didn't know how long I drove like that, trapped in some impossible loop. Time lost meaning, and exhaustion clawed at the edges of my mind. I whispered prayers, clenched the crucifix around my neck, and begged for it to end. And then suddenly it did. I found myself in a diner parking lot, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the early morning light. My truck was parked neatly, the engine off. I didn't remember stopping. I didn't remember pulling in. I stumbled out of the cab, the cold air shocking me awake. The diner was quiet, a lone waitress wiping down tables inside. I looked back at my truck, half expecting to see him standing there, but the lot was empty. Inside the diner, the waitress gave me a strange look as she poured my coffee. "Long night?" she asked, her voice gentle. "You could say that," I muttered. As I reached for the sugar, I noticed something on my hand. A single, dark smudge, like soot. I rubbed at it, but it wouldn't come off. The waitress smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You've been marked, you know." My blood ran cold. I looked up sharply, but she was already walking away, the sound of her footsteps fading into the kitchen. And then I realized I was the only customer in the diner. I sat in the diner, staring into my coffee cup as my thoughts spiraled. The waitress's words, "You've been marked," echoed in my head. My gut told me to leave, to get back in my truck and drive far away. But my body refused to move. It felt like an invisible weight pressed me into the booth, trapping me there. The smudge on my hand seemed darker now, almost pulsing against my skin like a living thing. When the waitress finally returned, her expression was eerily calm, her smile thin and unreadable. She slid a slice of pie in front of me without asking if I wanted it. "On the house?" she said, her voice soft and sweet, like a mother coaxing a frightened child. "I don't want it," I managed, my voice hoarse. "What did you mean? About being marked?" Her smile faltered, but only for a moment. "It's not the kind of mark you can see. Not fully. It's more spiritual, I guess you'd say. You saw him, didn't you? The Hat Man." I froze. "How do you know about him?" Her eyes flicked to the window, then back to me. "He's older than the roads, Pete. Older than anything we have words for. He's not a man, not really. Just something that wears the idea of a man." "Why me?" My voice cracked as I spoke. "What does he want from me?" She sat across from me, her demeanor suddenly grave. "He doesn't want anything from you. He just wants you. He feeds on fear, despair, hopelessness. The more you try to escape, the stronger he gets." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So what am I supposed to do? Just give up? Let him take me?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "But you can't fight him the way you'd fight anything else. The more you fear him, the more power he has over you. You have to accept him. Acknowledge he's there, but refuse to give him what he wants." "That's insane," I muttered, gripping the edge of the table. "How am I supposed to not be afraid of that thing?" Her smile returned, sad and knowing. "That's the trick, isn't it?" Before I could respond, the lights flickered. The buzzing of the neon sign outside grew louder, almost deafening, and a deep chill swept through the diner. The waitress stiffened, her eyes darting to the window again. "He's here," she whispered. I turned to look, my stomach dropping as the fog rolled in, wrapping around the diner like a living shroud. Through the glass, I saw his figure standing under the flickering neon, his shadow stretching impossibly long. "You need to decide, Pete," the waitress said, her voice urgent. "Do you want to keep running, or do you want to take back control?" The words barely registered. My gaze was locked on the Hat Man as he began to move, his impossibly long strides bringing him closer to the diner. I felt the air grow heavier, colder, as if the oxygen was being drained from the room. I don't know how," I stammered, panic rising in my chest. The waitress grabbed my hands, forcing me to look at her. Her eyes burned with intensity. "You do. It's not about bravery. It's about defiance. Don't give him your fear, Pete. Take it back." The door to the diner creaked open, and the room seemed to darken. I could feel him behind me, his presence like a void pulling me in. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to scream, to fight. But I didn't. Instead, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at the edges of my mind. "You don't own me." The room seemed to tremble, the air thick with pressure, but I kept my eyes shut, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my fear. "I'm not yours," I said again, louder this time. "Go back to wherever the hell you came from." The pressure lifted abruptly, like a storm breaking. When I opened my eyes, the diner was empty. The waitress was gone. The fog outside had vanished, and the Hat Man was nowhere to be seen. The only evidence he'd ever been there was the faint smudge on my hand, now faded to almost nothing. I left the diner without finishing my coffee, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. As I climbed into my truck and started the engine, I felt a strange sense of peace. The fear wasn't completely gone, it never would be, but it no longer controlled me. I still see him sometimes, in the shadows at the edge of the highway or in the reflection of a rearview mirror. But now, when he comes, I don't run. I don't scream. I just keep driving, my grip steady on the wheel, and my mind focused on the road ahead. And that's how I survived the Hat Man. Maybe you'll meet him someday too. But if you do, just remember, don't give him your fear.